Good morning, good afternoon, all of you. We are really happy of having the first student colloquium of the Master Degree in Cultural Studies. That is also part of the launching of the Humanitarian Observatory of Latin America and the Caribbean, and also the Master Degree in International Relations and the Master in Conflict Resolution. We have a fantastic conference today by Oscar Gomez. Oscar Gomez, he's an assistant professor at the Ritsumeikan Asia Pacific University in Japan. And he's going to give us a talk that is called Visiones del humanitario desde la periferia hacia una comparación de América Latina y el este asiático. Muchas gracias, Oscar, por estar acá y nos vemos.
Vale, Juan Ricardo, muchas gracias. Gracias a todos por conectarse hoy. Gracias por la introducción. Lo que les voy a presentar hoy es un resumen de un trabajo que he venido haciendo por algo más de 10 años y es un intento de condensar dos ramas de trabajo que he venido haciendo sobre Latinoamérica y sobre el este asiático acerca de lo que es el humanitarismo. Es un poco de trabajo en proceso, así que está lleno de preguntas. Sin embargo, pues es
Oscar,
compartirlo. Sí.
Remember that we have translation, so please speak a little bit, and then we'll translate, or we can do it through the English channel.
Would it be easier to present in English? I can do that as well.
But is there anyone in the room that does not speak English?
Not here.
Okay. Well, we can do it in English. Laura, thank you very much.
Okay, it's my pleasure. Let me move on. First, yeah, you have to, yeah. No, that's it. Yeah. First, I want to mention how I believe the humanitarian action and humanitarianism is too important for global governance nowadays. I believe it is the only part of one of the most important parts of global governance in which anybody from any country can connect. This idea of caring about the harm of people anywhere, regardless of their political affiliation or regardless of their religious beliefs, anything that we have to care about people that's feeling harm is a very strong driving force for global affairs. Is visible in the UN system, as you can see in the graph from 2018, and I think even before, most of the budget of the United Nations as a whole is being used in humanitarian action. But something I believe is more meaningful is this. This is the top donors, top recipients of international humanitarian assistance in 2011. And here there is something that for me, it's very close to the heart and very surprising. I mean, we have very strong floods in Pakistan because that's why Pakistan #1. We have a famine in Somalia, or the menace of famine, Palestine, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, and Japan. Japan was the 6th largest recipient of humanitarian assistance in 2011 because of the earthquake and tsunami. And you wouldn't expect to see such a country in that position, but it happened. and the aid came from everywhere. Everyone wanted to give a helping hand to Japan. And that's the power of humanitarian action. And that's why I believe it's too important to keep a sense of global community. However, regardless of this important role of humanitarianism in global governance, it is still seen as having a Western bias, because the system that we have nowadays mostly based on powerful UN agencies, especially UNHCR, WFP, and UNICEF, and some Western NGOs, international NGOs, is also seen as racist system, especially because it's usually portrayed as white men, white people saving brown people. And it's very colonial in its arrangement. It's been portrayed as reproducing some systems of powers that we thought we have overcome some decades ago. And therefore, there is something important we have to do about changing humanitarianism. And it's particularly important because this system was created and became consolidated after the liberal international order. And that order is seen in crisis nowadays, especially for two reasons: because of white right populist governments in the US and in the UK and other places in Europe, but also because of the rise of China and countries with seemingly different values. And therefore, there is some nervousness about what's going to happen after this change of order. And therefore, we have a need to change, to have a different visions and try to reimagine and understand what's going to happen after the order we have now is transformed. And therefore, the main question behind my presentation is, what kind of order or humanitarian orders, in plural, is going to replace the order that somehow we have nowadays? In order to think about this, the first thing that I need to think about is how to understand humanitarianism from the periphery, from outside the status quo. The first thing that we have to do in order to do that, I will suggest, is to leave behind the classic narratives and the classic roles of humanitarian action. And therefore, I won't be talking here about donors and beneficiaries, because that is only reproducing the power structures behind humanitarianism. The second thing we have to do is to avoid new totalizing narratives. And here I'm making a straightforward criticisms against the idea of the global South. That's why my presentation is not presented as the global South, but as the periphery, because I believe that there is no homogeneity in the periphery, and that things that are useful for the Philippines or for Cambodia may not be equally relevant for Honduras or for El Salvador or for Paraguay. We can learn, but we have to keep in mind the differences and the different experiences of these regions and countries. And therefore, I want to avoid giving a totalizing narrative. And third, it is necessary to re-examine what does it mean to be humanitarian, or what is humanitarianism about? Because it has been changing and shifting, and that's the idea behind the presentation today, depending on the time and the context we talk about. And here I have the most difficult methodological question, because then I need to decide in what's going to be the approach to this examination and to this comparison of these two regions. I think there are different ways of doing this. Something I have tried from the past is to concentrate on single types of crisis, but if you do that, usually the humanitarian side of it could be lost. So today, what I'm trying to do is to connect the histories of these two regions through three different dynamics of humanitarianism. And I will spend the rest of the presentation giving an overview of three different dynamics which somehow overlap nowadays when we talk about the humanitarian. And I would like to talk about how those dynamics are experienced from the periphery in this East Asia and Latin America. The three dynamics are the civilization dynamic. The second one is the liberal dynamic, the one we are kind of moving out of nowadays. And the last one is the post-liberal, which I will suggest is taking shape in the moment. The dates are just a suggestion. As I mentioned, there's a lot of overlap, but I included still in the slide just to have an idea of when and what is going on. So let me start saying that if we see it from the point of view of language, of English language, humanitarianism started to be a concept by the end of the 19th century. There is a prehistory of humanitarianism in Latin America, which is very famous, but I won't talk about that today, but if anybody's interested, we can, I mean, Juan Ricardo is very well keen on that, and he teaches about that, but I won't touch upon that issue today. If we see in Spanish, although I'm not quite confident about how good the Google Books database is for Spanish, it seems that the humanitarianism language came a little bit earlier than in English. And what happened in this beginning of humanitarianism is that humanitarianism was linked to something that was called the standard of civilization, something that was ingrained in the beginnings of international law, and especially in the last part of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. The standard of civilization was a very useful tool in those days because it established a hierarchy between countries or between societies in the 19th century. There were three types of societies in those days, basically. The civilized people, who were the Europeans, the barbarians, which were persons that have some culture, but still couldn't have direct deals with the Europeans, such as the Ottoman or the Japanese or the Kingdom of Siam, today's Thailand, Iran, Ethiopia, maybe India, and so forth. And you have the savages, which were the people without culture that required the supervision of the white civilized people in order to become civilized. So the standard of civilization was the legal tool to justify exclusion of inclusion, who could be member of the international community, and also domination, who has to remain a colony. Because it wasn't a standard, it looked like to be fair, to be like objective. And it was an issue of management. You fulfill some requirements and then you can become civilized. However, there was no definition about what the standard of civilization was. So it was a tool in order to reproduce and justify this very unfair system of the late 19th century. I will mention some of the things that were part of the standard of civilization that are related to humanitarianism. The first one, there were obligations towards foreigners. A civilized society, the society where the foreigners can walk around the streets and nobody kill them or menaces them. That's something that survives until today. And in the news, you will see if a tourist, a foreign tourist is attacked, there will be some special treatment, regardless other people being attacked as well. The treatment of missionaries was extremely important. Missionaries were supposed to be allowed to move around as they pleased. And this is crucial to understand differences between East Asia and Latin America, because missionaries have different standing in those societies. It was crucial to be part of international law, including the rules of war, what is going to become the international humanitarian law later. And this, as you can imagine, of course, this is crucial for understanding the dynamics of humanitarianism in the 19th century. And finally, you have to prohibit some practices that were considered uncivilized. Those include slavery, polygamy, and the sati, for example. The sati it was a custom in South Asia that when the husband dies, the widow has to immolate herself as part of the ritual of the burying. I don't have time to talk about all of this, but I want to concentrate in a bit on the rule of law, because it also has to do with the creation of the Red Cross that is going to be basic in talking about humanitarianism. It's important to take into account that at that moment of history, most of Latin America had been already independent for almost 100 years, while East Asia, you have in the south still some of the savages, but also some of the barbarians with Japan and China and Siam a part of this story. And an event that is crucial to understand what humanitarianism meant in this moment in history is the Russian-Japanese War, the beginning of the 20th century. It is important because it's the first time a country, a society outside of the West wins a war, not an independence war, a war. And they do it in a way that is humanitarian. And some people will say in those days that Japan is the world humanitarian leader. And why did that happen? Because Japan understood and they created their Red Cross very early to be recognized as a part of international society. And they provided medical treatment to over 17,000 Russian soldiers. They have hospital ships, which they used to provide this medical treatment to these Russian soldiers, and they even provide artificial limbs to those soldiers who lost them. So Japan was the first country that was capable of to be recognized because of their humanitarian credentials. We do not have a similar example in Latin America. The first Red Cross societies were created in Bolivia and Peru, as in part because of their border issues, the war they have. That was 1879. We have, the next one is Argentine, and because of some internal conflict going on in the country, but we don't have any country doing this, having such an impact in the humanitarian world as Japan. Liliana Obregón here, a professor here in Los Andes, has done some work about how the Latin America did try and have a lot of trouble being recognized in the world of international law. But I will say that it's not necessarily part of the humanitarian dynamic. So what I want to do with this first part, the first dynamic of humanitarian history, is to show some different points of departure, because East Asia and Latin America have different colonial status, because they also have a very different geopolitical position, and that's going to be relevant for the rest of the history. And both regions have a different religious context, and this is also going to be determinant in how the regions are portrayed in as humanitarian in the humanitarian world. However, there are some commune, shared driving forces, pressures on them, because both of the regions have to make a lot of effort to be recognized as civilized. And because of that, they gradually created Red Cross societies in their own countries, and they had to deal with issues of race and the way their societies were organized. Of course, the East Asia was the yellow peril, and Latin America was in this still ongoing situation, whether they are whites or browns or whatever they are, and how do they belong to the European community. This situation, and as I will make the transition to the next stage, and the recognition of societies keeps happening gradually. And this historian Van Dijk has a very, very interesting paper that I think that is very good to see how we transition into a new logic of humanitarianism. We have here a photo from Indonesia, in which at the time they get out of the Dutch control, they create their Red Cross. Although they are Muslims, they create a Red Cross. They don't create a Red Crescent. That's another story. And they manage to get recognition. But Vietnam does try the same, and they don't manage to do it. And they don't manage because of some special circumstances happening now, which is the Cold War, and a new way of thinking about the humanitarian action. And the most important, and anybody who have played some soccer game understand, is that the humanitarian dynamic start to work around a bipolar order or conflict. And therefore, humanitarianism stopped being about becoming civilized and start to be used to signal who were evil and who were bad, especially how communist and Soviet socialist societies were evil in their doings. So humanitarianism was part of the Cold War. And that's the reason why, or one of the reasons why Vietnam is not going to be accepted. Of course, this was the moment it was understood that it couldn't be you, the one deploying the humanitarian action, because you, I mean the big powers, because they won't be seen as neutral, and therefore they require some actors to do the management of humanitarianism. And it's the time in history in which the main UN agencies and the main international NGOs start to exist and consolidate their power. And therefore they're going to have, and they're going to be called the international humanitarian. And we will have somehow new types of crises. And here I want to talk about one specific one, which is the refugees. If we go again by English, there were no special use of refugees until late in the 20th century. And the refugee crisis is very useful for the consolidation of this new type of humanitarianism, because when you are a country that is accepting refugees, your capacities are not in doubt. And any Colombian understands, for example, that having been hosting millions of Venezuelans doesn't mean that the Colombian system is corrupt or bankrupt or evil. And therefore, you can mobilize international aid without making feel the recipient country, and I said I wasn't going to use that terminology, but just allow me this time. And at the same time, you can present a third country as evil. And therefore, everybody is happy in this dynamics. This was particularly important in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula after the Vietnam War, as the US loses the war, and you have then the Cambodian genocide, and you have Vietnam coming to the rescue, invading Cambodia and moving the Khmer Rouge out of power, but at the same time not being accepted as a savior, because since they were socialist, the Western status quo will say, no, they have some political interest. And the West will keep supporting the genocidal powers in exile until the 90s. This is also the moment in which we have what is called the boat people, and the image behind is this boat people reaching Hong Kong. And we have a massive movement of people out of Vietnam, and part of this economic pressure and the dynamics of Vietnam after the Vietnam War. I believe this is very similar to what's going on in Venezuela, and therefore there's a lot of things to think about this, but I won't spend too much time here. But this was basically the dynamic we have, and that the dynamic that helped consolidating the liberal system in those days. This system was consolidated around at least 3 types of dynamics or processes that we have in the humanitarian world. The first is recognizing the superiority of the international. So the UN will come and save us, most probably supported by the big powers. And the countries that are undergoing crisis are incapable of doing and solving them by themselves. And because of this, it's very important to have access to people. So a lot of the discourse on humanitarianism is going to be about how we manage to reach the people who's in danger, and what are the problems of reaching those persons in danger. And therefore, there's gonna be a taboo on receiving aid, on rejecting aid, sorry. So if you are a regime that is not welcoming these well-intended humanitarians, then you are evil, you are bankrupt, you are letting your people die, because millions of lives could be saved if only these humanitarian actors can enter the country. And it is somehow the new dynamic that we have and that we still somehow have nowadays. Here, I see a divergence between these 2 regions. As I mentioned, East Asia, it's been at the core of those discussions, especially because what went on in the Indo-Chinese Peninsula, and also, but I don't have to talk about this, but I have written a paper about this if you're curious, because how Japan didn't manage to continue being part of the humanitarian system. However, if you check what's going on in Latin America still have some things some crises that could be considered humanitarians, like military regimes and desaparecidos in the south, in Chile, Argentina, and Brazil. You have wars in Central America, civil wars. But if you check the history of humanitarian action, these kinds of situations are rarely included in the canon of what was humanitarian action. You will mostly see is Asia, including South Asia, and also Africa, and as well as the Middle East, but not Latin America. And this, for me, is very puzzling, and I have been trying to deal with this problem for some time, and I have written a couple of papers on this, but I don't have much time to talk about this. So something very strange happened during the Cold War. Instead, Latin America had a different kind of visions through which they managed this instability. One of those is human rights, which have been at the core of the function of states in Latin America, and not only of states, but of resistance movements of Latin America. And you also have the theology of liberation and other ways of understanding social crisis and harm and how to deal with them. So this is what I see is the second phase of humanitarianism. Lastly, we have a break in this liberal system. And I will use as this breaking point to the last part of the talk and the last part of this effort to comparing this region. I see this point in the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. In this respect, we do have some comparison, some situations that are similar in Latin America. Hurricane Mitch in 1998 was kind of also important, but I will say that also from the 80s, and we have the tragedy of Armero here in Colombia, and you have already some movement of some agencies showing a different kind of humanitarian action that I will talk about later. But the Indian Ocean tsunami was very important because in the history of the world, it's been the disaster in which much more money has been gathered in order to deal with it. So much money that it was possible to have a decent evaluation of the international response, which usually never happens. And this joint evaluation found, and many others, two important critical situations in this in the aftermath of the tsunami. The first one is that national authorities understood they were being forced and that they have to react and to become stronger to be able to have ownership on their own crisis responses because they needed to make a better job protecting their citizens, but also, and this is quite important, because international cooperation, it's very bad. It's very harmful. The experience of international cooperation in Indonesia and in general after the tsunami in this evaluation is depicted as very problematic for different things. For example, bringing pork food to Muslims, making unnecessary things, making coordinations in languages that are not spoken by locals, and therefore just replicating some colonial systems. And therefore, it was very clear that something had to be done. Here, I see a convergence in these two regions. Finally, there seems to be some agreement. On the one hand, in Southeast Asia, there's been some regional leadership in order to do humanitarian assistance by themselves. This was clear in Cyclone Nargis in Myanmar in 2008 when the junta said, I don't want anybody. And France and others say, oh, we will have to invade Myanmar because they are evil. and ASEAN say, no, just wait. If we do it ourselves, we can actually help the people. We have China in 2008, just right before the Olympics, having a major earthquake and say, you want to come? Just come and let's see if it works. Of course, international cooperation not working much. We have something very similar, I would say, in Latin America with Brazil, Chile, Mexico, and others trying to do something in Haiti, which has been the exception in the region. We have a new diplomacy of disaster response in which when you have an earthquake in Mexico, everybody will go and say, hello, we are the Latin Americans, we help each other. When you have forest fires in Chile, you will have people from all the region going and say, hey, hello, see, we are Latin Americans brothers, and we do it by ourselves. And somehow I will say in Colombia, we have, and in Latin America, some movement to be welcoming with what's going on in Venezuela. We also have, at the same time, still resistance against being portrayed as humanitarian crisis because of internal displacement in Colombia, which has been an issue, and we could spend hours talking about the Colombian situation, but also in Mexico, which they do not recognize, which is a different conversation, and also because of urban violence in Central America and in the favelas in Brazil, which also countries resist to see as humanitarian. And we have something very interesting going on in Southeast Asia and as well. And we have this movement from ASEAN, from Myanmar in 2008 saying, you don't come, and then France and others saying, let's invade Myanmar, to Indonesia and earthquake and tsunami in Sulawesi in 2018, when you have the Indonesian government saying, please don't come, we don't need you, just stay outside because we can deal with this disaster ourselves. And if we need you, we will let you know, but for now, just don't come. And the Red Cross and others saying, very good. That's the way we should deal with disasters in the future. Your response is a model of humanitarian response. And therefore, we have a new system in the making. However, I won't say these are perfect systems. The ASEAN way in Myanmar after the new military government hasn't been very useful in protection, and we have a lot of things going on in Myanmar these days. And there is a perennial issue about the Uyghur in China and how to protect human rights in China that we still are dealing with. And in Latin America, those problems are still problems, the internal migration and gang violence. And we have a political flavor on international aid with people like Lula and Chavez humanitarian assistance in order to pursue some diplomatic goals. And we also have something similar in Chile between right and left governments and the treatment they gave or they give to migrants. And also the way that the previous president of Colombia, in collaboration with the US, tried to use Venezuelan migration to promote a regime change in Venezuela. So this is not a perfect order at all, but it's different, I will argue. So in conclusion, I want to say that out of the liberal emphasis on access, we are moving to an emphasis on effectiveness, and that the solutions we promote actually reach people. We are moving out of a taboo on rejecting aid towards more reciprocity and solidarity. So you give me aid, I receive it, but you have to receive my aid because we are brothers, we are equal, we are horizontal. It's not about just you trying to force me to receive things I don't want, and you never receiving anything from me. To a more horizontal system. And we are moving out of the superiority of the international to a cooptation of the international, in which now that the countries in the periphery understand they have the power to manage their own crisis, they can use the international whenever they see fit for whatever interests or purposes they have. And that's the new order I think is somehow coming to become. There are some issues that are left to think about. I wonder if the issues of race and being recognized a member of the international community are still relevant. I think they are relevant. Race is still important. And we have seen that different in the way that Syrian refugees are not accepted, but Ukrainian refugees are welcome. There are issues of recognition. Taiwan has a Red Cross society as part of their efforts to still be recognized a country. I believe there's more need of more effort to understand why the Cold War is being so different. I have different hypotheses. I have published about that a bit. We need to think about that much more. There is a very strange role of the church in this history that I also think hasn't been discussed very much. Important in the way that Latin America was not framed as a humanitarian failure during the Cold War time, but I think it's been also important in Latin America not having had a more proactive humanitarian projection towards the world. But this is up to debate. And of course, we need to go through different crises and different solidarities. But this is part of the agenda for future research. Thanks very much for your patience and welcome. Oh, sorry. And what this means for the future. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Oscar. Everyone is applauding here. I don't know if there's any questions. Juan Pablo is in Bogotá. I want to break the ice because I have like two questions, right? First one also will be like, are you implying that we're more or less seeing in this new humanitarianism from the global south? Because at least maybe can we see it in that way, the humanitarianism from the global south and the connection with what different scholars and movements are calling the decolonization of the humanitarian, no? And that's the first question. And the second is, as you said it at the last point, no? Certainly here in Cartagena, we'll be talking about how movements in the grassroots level are more or less, we had a great debate on Philippines, no, Lorraine? And we're very much about how organizations are struggling to define the way in which disasters have to be handled, no? Very active in trying to say that the state, at the exception, is not the only one that is able to assess what has to be happening, no? But really interesting, like grassroots organization on the disasters agenda, no? So more or less trying to take you a little bit away from the scale of the nation state and going into the much more grassroots social movement level, no? How do you see in that level that things are going on both in Asia and both in South America? And I know that these are two large questions.
Thanks very much, Juan Ricardo. The first one, as I tried to mention, I don't think there is a single model in terms, or there's going to be a single model about how to deal with the humanitarian crisis. However, I do see some convergence in in the way in which the liberal humanitarian system is being contested. I'm not quite sure if decolonizing is the best way to describe that, because as I mentioned, Latin America has been outside of colonial regime for more than 200 years. And there is the place where I see some issues with that very easy critique of the power distribution on the system. So I do see change, but I'm not quite sure if I will describe it as you do it. And most probably we will still have different flavors of crisis management depending on the regions we are. But what I do believe is that that hegemonic humanitarianism that was supposed to become the rule out of the Cold War is not going to be the main driving force anymore. For the second question, I think here that's going to be a different talk. And I think I mentioned at the beginning that I'm this presentation, I'm with my hat of international relations scholars, but I also have a hat of public policy scholar, in which I think this conversation is happening in a more interesting way. Because when you go to the grassroots, being portrayed as humanitarian is not important at all. And when you ask common people in any country, and we did a survey about this in Southeast Asia in my previous job at JICA, everyone replied that when they want to get people some support after crisis situations, they want their states to be the ones providing this support. And somehow, states after the Indian Ocean tsunami, but I believe that, I mean, this is a simplification, but just stay with me with this argument. States are trying to do their job. And grassroots organizations have to confront something very, very difficult to do, which is to be successful. And this is something that I have seen, and for me, it was very interesting, something I did during my master's in Japan, in that the Japanese environmental movement fought and was very strong and very critical of what the government was doing. And in the 70s, they were successful, and the government said, yes, you are right, we were wrong. We will have to do something about the environment, and we will put new legislation, we will invest, we will create a ministry of the environment, and we'll do that many changes that happen in Japan. And Japan nowadays is recognized as being clean and green and whatever. And what happened with the grassroots movements in Japan? They disappear because their goal was fulfilled. They want to be protected against environmental threats, and then they disappear. I feel somehow that grassroots movements in Latin America and in Southeast Asia and East Asia can have similar challenges in the future, that they do things and they do advocacy, and somehow the state listens to them and they become part of the system, and the states start to improve their systems in order to do the things that they are supposed to be doing. And that becomes a challenge for those organizations, because no citizen is expecting grassroots movements to be the ones providing security against crisis. And therefore, what is going to be the role of them? There are difficult choices there. I have mentioned that in one of my publications as well. I believe there are two ways in which this change is happening. Some of these organizations are becoming more critical or more human rights oriented. So in order to advocate to make sure that the promises that governments have made of protection are actually fulfilled. And the second one is they are becoming consultants of the government. And similar to what is going on right now here in Colombia, that the disaster authority has made communitary pots, in Japanese is takidashi, making what communities do to provide food after a disaster. I'm making something official out of that. And therefore now the state is the one supporting what usually grassroots movements were supposed to be doing. And therefore you become a consultant or a implementing partner of the government, with all the implications that have for you to raise critical voices. So I think that's part of the challenges that these organizations have to confront in this new reality.
Thank you, Oscar, very much. I don't know if Juan, you want to talk a little bit?
I want to ask something. I want to ask to Oscar. I think you talked in the beginning of the presentation about like kind of a methodology of how you, what was the like your scheme of things to work with these two different contests. And I think it's about the theory and the epistemology, if you want, about estudios comparados, like comparative studies. So I want to ask about what would you think that is the main challenges and the main good things about doing this kind of studies? Because, for example, in cultural studies, you have to be very contextual. And here you kind of, I don't know, is the question, you kind of lose like some contextuality if you like, but you maybe gain something else. So I want to ask you about that.
Thanks very much. That's a very crucial question. Yeah, you sacrifice a lot of context out of this kind of comparison, but I believe something that, I mean, one thing is that we also require these macro narratives in order to have some basic or common of the understanding of what's going on or how do we relate to humanitarian discussions in the world. And I think that that's part of what the liberal, the international liberal order tried to do, to have a common narrative, universal narrative. But I don't believe that the option of only having different, accepting different practices in different contexts, it's a welcome solution, because that will move towards relativism, which can be very dangerous when we talk about the lives of people. So here I'm making an ethical point about the importance of having a universal narrative, because I do believe that certain, regardless the context, certain practices should be banned. So what's going on in Afghanistan with women shouldn't be allowed. And we cannot say that because of the context of Afghanistan, this way of dealing should be respected. So I do see the value on the whole history of humanitarianism, the 200 years, and trying to get at this universal. I think there is value on that. And therefore, we need to keep trying to reach those universals which we can only find, and that's the point of the comparison. Well, trying to see at different societies and trying to find those common points that we could agree on.
So I don't know if maybe some people in YouTube have any questions. I am here to watch about that.
Hi, Oscar. This is Thea. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Do you hear me one time or 6 times? There's an echo. Anyway, Oscar, to be honest, I don't really have a question, but I just wanted to say how valuable I find your presentation. I really like this kind of regional histories of humanitarianism and to see how humanitarianism evolved in different places in different ways. And sometimes even before we might imagine it was there, like what you're saying, how Japan in this very early years of the 20th century was having a humanitarian reputation, something I didn't know about, to be honest. So I think this is really good that you open our eyes. And I thought it was very interesting that you then compare to countries that I wouldn't even know they would have these type of relations of solidarity. So I don't have a question, but I learned a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Thea.
And here comes Rod.
Hi, Oscar. Well, first of all, thanks so much. I really also took a lot of notes, what's really interesting. I have only one little question is, because it seems in what you were showing about the graph, especially that you use the word humanitarianism, did you also check for other terms that people might be using in the past to refer to the same phenomena, but maybe not using the same term? As you said, for example, not only human rights, but maybe people frame it as solidarity or relief, or, I mean, we have seen that people have been using different terms from different reasons, sometimes politically. Even now, people sometimes avoid the concept of humanitarian action because of some connotations. So how much you were able or not to consider those kind of nuances in the use of the concept when we trace it back to history? Thanks so much, and again, congratulations.
Thanks very much for the point. Yeah, that's something I haven't done in any systematic way at the moment. Well, you are well aware that we can kind of easily do that in Latin America because we share the Spanish. But in East Asia and Southeast Asia, we do not have this common language, this lingua franca. And therefore, we are left to the official UN parlance as part of the way of understanding. So yeah, I haven't checked Bahasa, I haven't checked Khmer, I haven't checked Tagalog. No, I'm not aware of that. And I don't know if that's going to be a productive. I haven't checked Chinese. I haven't checked even Japanese, because the only Google Books like a database that there is for Japanese is you have to pay to use it. So I haven't seen the value on trying to doing that. So therefore, I have concentrated on the identifying the main breaking points, or the main what we call international relations, the critical junctures, the places in which you can see some norms being changed and some behaviors changing in order to explain this, which is going to be historical institutionalist approach to the history, to humanitarianism. But on the other hand, and I think you are doing a nice job on solidarity as well. So I'm really looking forward to what your observations about Latin America are. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna pass the mic to Alex, who have a question, comment, or something to say. Thanks so much, Oscar, again.
Okay, thank you so much, Oscar, for the excellent presentation. I have one question on the conclusion part. And you stated the current trend, the trajectory is, or the humanitarian sector is transitioning from the challenge of access to the effectiveness of humanitarian aid. I think this conclusion may not be generalized for the whole global south, as we have some countries which are still experiencing a challenge with humanitarian access. If your conclusion is specific to countries in Latin America, is there any experience or practices that can be shared with the countries in Africa, in the continent of Africa, that are still encountering problem with access? Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, indeed. I haven't, I'm not saying that this is, access has stopped being an issue. What I'm trying to say in this presentation is that access being the main issue in or access being the sacrosanctum piece of humanitarianism is being contested because multiple societies have come out to say we don't need you, and they haven't faced criticism because they say that doesn't mean, and that was what I tried to show in the end. Of course, Myanmar could be an issue, in China it could be an issue, and so on. So yeah, access still is going to be a challenge, but will not be taken for granted when we talk about humanitarian action, and cannot be pushed too strong as it was pushed before. On the other hand, if Latin America has something to say about this for the rest of the world, well, I think that in the end, it's local states and local societies which can actually come up with solutions that are good enough to protect people. And therefore, there's been a turn all around all kinds of crisis literature. You can name it, disasters, but also peace building and development as well, in which it is local initiatives and whatever the local politics can actually do, and how you work them. I mean, how you can make them have more positive impact, what in the end is going to be meaningful, not international humanitarian action. Humanitarian action is not going to be the solution to those problems. And therefore, I believe that what is going on is a movement outside of that kind of thinking of humanitarianism. And therefore, humanitarian logics will mutate in order to, I hope, to be more supportive of those local initiatives rather than believing that they are providing any solutions.
Okay. Juan Pablo, is there any question through YouTube?
No, we don't have any more questions in YouTube.
Okay. So I think anyone here, more questions? I think people here, Juan, Oscar, are really exhausted, no? Oscar, thank you very much. I think this has been a great way to finish the day, no? A great talk about comparing. Okay. So.
There would have been one better way to end the day, Oscar, and that is if you would have been with us here in Cartagena to do your presentation, we could have a good dinner at the beach afterwards. But anyhow, we cannot have it all. Thanks a lot.
And Juan Pablo, this is also for you. Juan, thank you very much for all the organization. It was really good. I think you, Oscar, left us with a lot of ideas to connect thinking about the different ways in which the humanitarian is being created, recreated, registered, reconfigured, etc., etc., etc. So really thank you much from the observatory. I think also you raised great question about the relation between power and subjectivities and government. No, that's also very interesting for us in cultural studies. So basically, I'm going to finish here. Thank you much. Please go for a beer or coffee or whatever you want to do. Thank you, Juan Pablo, again. Thank you very much. Thank you, all the people from the Facultad de Ciencias Sociales. Andrea, Alex, thank you much. And goodbye. Have a pleasant night.
Thanks very much. Thank you for taking time out of your time in Cartagena and keep enjoying. And thank you for coming. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, ciao, ciao.
Ciao.